Right. So what I'm going to talk about is some field trials that we've done using largely the materials that we've just been hearing about. So it will be interesting to sort of see how they performed in the field. And our trials had a number of aims. We were interested in comparing the performance in the first instance of a range of biodegradable and non-biodegradable plastics with regard to their ability to suppress weeds, the effect on the crop yield and quality, how rapidly they degraded, either biodegraded or just degraded generally. We wanted to look at what detrimental compounds might be released into the soil, either in the form of plasticizers or microplastics, and sort of by inference what effect that might have on soil health. And also we hope to gather some data that could be used for the environmental impact of each treatment, the kind of the life cycle analysis, the sort of thing that we heard about in an earlier talk this morning. We thought we'd be able to produce some information that would be of a value there. So in our film mulch trials, this kind of picture on the left shows basically the layout of it, but they were laid out in with 4 blocks with randomized treatments within each of those blocks. Each plot was 4 meters long, and we did the whole experimental setup on a bed system because we're doing this work in collaboration with a commercial grower, a community supported agriculture scheme that's based on site at Ryton, where our offices are, and they use a kind of a tractor bed system for their production, and we kind of fitted into their existing system. And indeed the commercial biodegradable treatments that we used, they use them on a larger scale as well. We had 2 test crops, onions and cabbages. The treatments, we did this work in 2019 and also in 2020. The treatments were basically the same. There were some slight variations. In the second year, we weren't able to get one of the commercial biodegradable films, and so we substituted a commercial paper mulch as something that was a little bit different. We thought that would be interesting to try, and as we've just been hearing, we used this new cut 3 black mulch rather than the cut 2 with the filler in, which didn't do so well in the first year, as we'll see in a minute. We can just sort of skip through that. You don't need to read all the words here, but just basically to say that we before planting we sampled the soil at 3 depths, primarily to look at sort of what the pre-existing levels of plastic pollution were in the soil, and with and sampled the soil at the time of harvest as well. And then we laid the plots, that we laid the different mulches down. You can see in the bottom photo there just the kind of what the trials looked like before we planted anything, the individual plots. We tried as far as we could to sort of simulate what would the commercial practice that would be done. So we kind of tucked them into the edges in it, so that they kind of with a sort of, so they mimicked the way that this was done with kind of normal farm machinery as far as we could, as regards sort of the tension and everything like that. And then we planted out the crops. So we can see using a kind of a template there to punch the holes just through the plastic. One of the treatments, the woven polypropylene mulch, that was too tough to actually punch the holes by hand. We actually burnt holes with a blowtorch through the template, and that was so that was the only one that was required for. And we used these 2 test crops in the same in both years. Onions we used Red Baron, planted as sets. Cabbages we used Impala, which were planted through the mulch as transplants. Just go on to say a little bit about the results now. The onion growth, I think you've seen a very similar photo to this as well. By early June, significant amounts of weeds emerged in the unweeded controls, and also between the white mulches, tearing them apart, bursting through, and by sort of the midsummer, there really only scraps of them remained in the onion trial, so they were kind of they weren't really effective at all there. All the black mulches effectively suppressed the weeds until the harvest. Shortly after harvest, it was interesting to see that the polythene mulch, which is of course non-biodegradable, that really began to degrade quite rapidly once it was kind of exposed, sort of when the onion crop wasn't there anymore, and really rapidly disintegrated into fragments. Whereas the biodegradable mulches stayed relatively intact across the bulk of the plot, but they really degraded around the edges, and so then they came loose and blew away in the wind. So there's quite a different pattern of how they degraded, which was interesting. Just sort of some more quantitative results here. You can see the weed biomass from 2019 and also from 2020. You can see there's basically a similar pattern. All the black mulches were effective at preventing weed growth. The white mulches in both years were not, and obviously the blue bar there, you can see the second from the left in each case, they were the unweeded control plots. So unsurprisingly, there was quite a lot of weeds in them. And the onion yield was almost the kind of the inverse of the weed results. Very low yields in the unweeded plots and where the white mulches were. It's interesting that that one of the white mulches, cut 2, though, although it did disintegrate, it was reasonably able to keep the weeds suppressed in the very early stage of establishment. And I think that meant that there was some beneficial effects on yield, but really it was the onions are a very poor quality and quite small. So I think you can basically say that cut 1 and cut 2 weren't effective in the onion plots. It was interesting that in 2020, the unweeded control didn't do so well as the as any of the black mulch treatments, and we think that was probably because the mulches were able to help retain water in the soil. We had a very dry summer, particularly basically the day that we put the mulches down and planted the onions was the last day that it rained, and so it was very dry. And I think that the mulches definitely seemed to have some beneficial effect over and above their weed suppressive effect. So that was interesting. Just to say briefly something about the cabbages, we've only got results from 2019 because we haven't harvested our cabbages. Initially look very similar to the onions, but of course what's interesting is the cabbages are a much more competitive crop. That they cover the soil a lot better, and so although the white mulches cut 1 and cut 2 did degrade, they were still kind of effective enough in order to be able to get a reasonable cabbage yield. The best yield came from the woven polypropylene mulch, and that's kind of an interesting fact because that's come out quite well in the performance side of things. And I think if we can do some life cycle analysis, it will show some. It might come out better than the single use, even the single use biodegradable mulches, because it can be used in successive years. So that's a useful fact to confirm. So that was all that we've done with the film mulches. We were very interested in the use of kind of a range of materials that could be produced on farm, kind of locally sourced, sort of avoiding the need for these industrialized produced mulches sold on a roll, shipped from a long way away, with all the kind of implications of, kind of resilience of the farming system and all of that kind of thing. It seemed that we should investigate this, and so we set up, just in 2020, we looked at 6 what you might call on-farm materials. We had one of them was the extruded poplar that we've just heard about, that was provided by ATB in Germany. We compared that with the poplar chips that were used to extrude it. We used willow chips, which we sourced locally from Coventry. We also looked at green waste compost, grass clippings, that's like fresh grass clippings that were cut just sort of the day before, and also hay. So those are the six materials that we investigated. We applied all of those at two different rates. We had a high rate and a low rate, based on the kind of the volumes, so either 15 or 30 litres per metre squared, which did we thought quite a lot about what the right rates of application should be. Both rates are actually quite high if you work it out in how much you'd need to do a whole hectare, but that's something to think about for the future. We didn't grow any crops in this trial, which you can see there in the photo. Really, the plots were too small. It was just like a preliminary study, really, to investigate how well these different mulches would perform. And you can see in these graphs here, we monitored the weed cover. These are just kind of visual estimations of the weed cover. It's sort of roughly fortnightly over a couple of months period. In the top graph, you can see the ones that applied at low rate, and the bottom graph, the ones that applied at high rate. Basically, none of the low rate were really very effective after a month, and at the high rate, only really the hay was the only one that really significantly suppressed the weeds. You can see here we did have a lot of weeds. Particularly, there was this one called Gallant Soldier, which is quite an invasive species that's really taken off at our site, really only in the last 5 years or so. And it's an annual weed that grows really vigorously, and it's quite a lot of work to combat it. And you can see we did make some quantitative measurements, and we also of the kind of the weed biomass, and we also made some assessments of the soil nutrients, particularly the mineral nitrogen underneath the mulches, because obviously some of these materials, unlike the films, you're actually adding quite a lot of nutrients, and some of them you're adding quite a lot of carbon, which might suck nutrients out of the soil. So it's a kind of a more complicated picture. So the interim conclusions, as I say, the work's going on, is that the black fill mulches effectively suppress the weeds. Even a mulch that broke down, however, before the end of the growing season could be worthwhile, depending on the crop. For particularly the crops that become more competitive later on in the season, they might still be of use. The woven polypropylene remained intact, obviously can then be used in successive years. And we think that the loose mulches can certainly offer an on-farm alternative to the films, but really need to be applied at a high rate to be effective, and this can have effects perhaps on the nutrient dynamics. Unfortunately, our work to sort of assess the soil contamination with both the plasticizers and microplastics has been delayed by the coronavirus, because we couldn't get into the laboratories over the summer to do the extractions and the tests, but we hope to be able to catch up with that over the winter period. And just finally to say that we've been working with an organisation in Britain. I think there are some people from it here today, the Innovative Farmers Network, to conduct additional trials under commercial conditions on farms around the country, and it will be interesting when the results from those come in to kind of see how they support or contradict what we've found in our trials at the Coventry site. And I think that's basically what I've got to say.